Imagine the Earth 3.2 million years ago. The world was raw, unrefined, and pulsing with the rhythm of nature's first true symphony. The land stretched endlessly under a golden African sun, where vast grasslands rippled like waves in the wind. Towering acacia trees dotted the horizon, flat canopies offering shade to the life that thrived beneath them. The air carried the scent of wet soil and wild grass, a mix of calm and tension, because here, survival was never guaranteed. The story begins 3.2 million years ago, when the Earth was young and wild, its surface breathing with volcanic heat, its skies painted in hues of gold and crimson, and its land teeming with life that was both ancient and awakening. The continents were not yet shaped as we know them. The great African plains stretched endlessly, filled with rivers that shimmered under the early morning sun, their waters feeding the roots of tall acacia trees and the wide grasslands that waved like oceans in the wind. It was a time before cities, before history, before humanity had learned to speak its first word. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and dust, and every living creature, from the smallest insect to the greatest beast, moved to the rhythm of survival. The Earth was alive in its purest form, untamed, unbroken, breathtakingly real. Herds of ancient mammals roamed across the open plains. Early elephants, with smaller tusks and long shaggy coats, grazing alongside the ancestors of zebras and gazelles. Massive birds, some flightless and others gliding on vast wings, ruled the skies and the grasslands. Predators, sleek and fierce, stalked the shadows. Saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, and packs of wild dogs with primal cunning. Life was a balance of fear and beauty, a dance of existence where every dawn brought both promise and peril. In this raw, unforgiving wilderness, nature was the only law, and adaptation was the only path to survival. The Earth, though ancient, was still in its formative years, reshaping itself with every earthquake and storm, its mountains rising and rivers carving new paths. Each gust of wind carried the seeds of evolution, whispering change into the bones of the creatures that called this planet home. Amid this landscape walked a new kind of being, not yet human but no longer just another animal, Homo habilis, the handyman. A species standing at the dawn of intelligence. Small, curious, and alert, they lived in small groups, forming the earliest communities of cooperation and learning. Their hands were unlike any that came before them, nimble, precise, and creative. With stones they shaped tools, breaking and chipping them into sharp edges to hunt, cut, and survive. They were inventors in the making, pioneers of thought in a world ruled by instinct. Their faces carried the first hints of emotion recognizable to us now. The furrow of worry, the spark of curiosity, the glint of wonder. At night, they gathered near fires kindled by lightning, staring into the flames as though seeing their own reflection in its flicker. Fire became more than warmth. It was a symbol of control, the first sign that humanity was learning to command nature rather than merely endure it. And yet, they were still children of the wild, bound to the earth and its rhythms. They hunted small animals, gathered fruits and roots, watched the skies for signs of storms and predators. They were fragile but determined, their survival a daily act of courage. Every step they took across the dusty plains was a step toward a new chapter in life's grand design. But they were not alone. Among the most extraordinary creatures sharing their world was the giant ostrich ancestor, a bird that stood over 10 feet tall, towering even above the tallest of the early hominins. Its feathers were thick and rough, protecting it from the sun and wind, and its eyes, large, golden, and filled with awareness, scanned the horizon for threats. This bird was a living relic of an earlier age, a symbol of nature's brilliance and power. Long, muscular legs could send it racing across the grasslands at incredible speed, each stride a blur of strength and balance. When threatened, unleash kicks powerful enough to crush bones. Yet, despite its size and might, it was not a predator. It was a creature of grace, survival, instinct. The giant ostrich ancestor lived in herds, nesting in shallow pits near water sources, protecting its eggs and young with fierce devotion. The earth's great plains were its kingdom, and within that kingdom, every sound, every shadow, every gust of wind carried meaning. To live was to listen, observe, to endure. As days turned to seasons and seasons to ages, a delicate thread began to weave between these two beings. The intelligent Homo habilis and the powerful ostrich ancestor. They shared the same rivers, the same food sources, the same dangers. Their lives, though separate, were intertwined by the invisible hand of evolution. When Homo habilis watched the great bird flee from predators with swift precision, they learned the value of speed and strategy. When the bird avoided danger through vigilance, the early humans began to understand awareness as a tool of survival. Nature was the first teacher, and every creature was a lesson. This ancient world was not silent. It hummed with communication, the cries of birds echoing across the plains, the growls of distant beasts, the rustle of grass beneath unseen feet. Even the wind seemed alive, whispering through the trees and carrying the scent of rain and earth. The early humans listened, learned, and adapted, their minds growing sharper with each passing generation. Somewhere within them, perhaps unknowingly, seed of thought, of consciousness, had begun to bloom. This was the beginning, the true dawn of life's awareness. The earth itself was a living classroom, and every sunrise was a lesson in endurance and discovery. The rivers told stories of migration, the stars taught direction, the bones of fallen creatures revealed both danger and opportunity. Life, in all its rawness, demanded respect, patience, courage, and slowly, through trial and error, through fear and curiosity, Homo habilis began to rise. Not just as survivors, but as thinkers. The world around them was both their enemy and their guide, shaping their minds as surely as the wind shaped the mountains. Over time, they would become hunters, builders, and dreamers. But here, in this distant beginning, they were merely learners, standing at the threshold of destiny. Thus began the grand saga of life 3.2 million years ago, a world of endless sky and untold stories, where every creature played a part in the symphony of existence. The great ostrich ancestor ran with the wind, the Homo habilis watched and learned, mountains rose and fell, storms swept the land, and the cycle of birth, death, and survival continued unbroken. It was a world without words, yet full of meaning, a silent orchestra of evolution composing the melody of life. And though time would wash away the footprints of those early beings, the legacy of their existence would echo forever in the blood and bones of all who came after. For it was in this world, this wild earth, that the story of us truly began. Chapter 2: The Awakening of the Early Earth. When survival became understanding, the world 3.2 million years ago was not merely a place of life and death. It was a living organism itself, a great breathing entity where every gust of wind and every drop of rain played a part in shaping destiny. The sun rose heavy and golden over the African plains, bathing the endless grasslands in a warm, trembling light that made the earth shimmer like molten metal. Rivers coiled like silver snakes across the landscape, carving paths through fertile soil where the first whispers of civilization would one day bloom. Volcanoes smoked faintly in the distance, sending plumes of ash into the air that mixed with the cries of early birds, awakening to the dawn. Herds of ancient animals stirred from their resting places. Massive elephants with thick, wary hair and curved tusks, primitive horses galloping through the mist, and strange small antelopes leaping between the shadows of tall grasses. The air was alive with sound, the beating of wings, the distant roar of predators, the rhythmic clicking of insects, the gentle rustle of leaves as early hominins began to move through their day. This was the theater of evolution, where the stage was the entire planet and every creature played its part with instinctive precision. In this living mosaic walked Faces Homo habilis, the first spark of what we would become. They were not yet masters of the world, but they were students of it, quietly observing, learning, imitating the movements of nature itself. Their small bodies were built for both climbing and walking, their hands strong yet delicate, shaped by generations of adaptation. Their faces bore the beginnings of thought, a spark in their eyes that hinted at awareness. They did not yet have language as we know it, but they communicated through gestures, through sounds, through the silent understanding that comes only from shared survival. They lived in small bands, families bound by trust and necessity. Dawn brought a new test: finding food, avoiding predators, protecting the young, and seeking water under the blazing sun. Yet within these struggles lay the foundation of something greater, an awakening mind. When Homo habilis picked up a stone and struck it against another to form a sharp edge, it was not just an act of instinct. It was creation. It was thought. It was the first step toward invention, a spark that would burn through millions of years to become the flame of human civilization. These early humans shared the earth with creatures far larger, faster, and more dangerous than themselves. Yet among them, one stood out not for its savagery, for its majesty. The giant ostrich ancestor, a towering bird whose power and grace commanded the respect of all who saw it. It was a creature of immense size, rising nearly 10 feet high, with feathers that shimmered in tones of gray and bronze beneath the sunlight. Legs were columns of muscle, its feet strong enough to outrun even the fiercest predator. When it moved, it seemed to glide across the land, the wind itself parting around its speed. Its eyes were sharp and reflective, capable of seeing danger from miles away. Its instincts were as old as the earth itself. Though flightless, it was the embodiment of freedom, a being perfectly adapted to its world, living not through cunning, but through balance and strength. The ostrich ancestor represented the perfection of instinct, while Homo habilis represented the birth of reason. Between them, the two species stood as symbols of evolution's dual paths, one mastering the physical, the other awakening to the mental. Each day on the ancient plains was a lesson written in dust and blood. The sun scorched the earth by midday, forcing both man and beast to seek shelter beneath the sparse shade of trees. When storms rolled in, dark clouds tore across the sky and thunder cracked like the voice of creation, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Lightning split the heavens and struck dry trees, igniting the first wildfires, terrifying yet mesmerizing to the early humans who watched from afar. They did not yet understand the science of it, but they felt its power, its warmth, and its light. Fire was both a destroyer and a giver of life. Flickering glow, Homo habilis saw not just fear, but possibility. Perhaps, in one such storm, a brave hand reached toward the dying embers, testing the heat, learning to hold the flame. That was the moment thought became mastery. The moment survival began to merge with understanding. The earth was also a place of constant change. The ground quaked, reshaping valleys and rivers. New species emerged while others vanished into the quiet of extinction. The early humans witnessed death often, and through it, they began to sense something profound. That life was fragile, fleeting, and precious. They started to remember, to connect moments together, forming the earliest threads of memory. A Homo habilis might recall where the herd crossed the river last season, fruit trees had grown before the rains, or where danger had once lurked. Memory was evolution's greatest gift, for it allowed the mind to build upon the past and imagine the future. The world, once only a battlefield of instinct, was slowly becoming a realm of thought. The dawn of awareness had begun. As Homo habilis moved through this awakening world, their eyes often caught sight of the giant bird in the distance. A figure both awe-inspiring and humbling. Sometimes they followed it, watching how it found food, how it protected its young, how it fled from danger with precision and speed. In the bird, they saw nature's perfection, a teacher without words, and perhaps, as they studied it, they began to understand that survival was not merely strength, but also wisdom. The ostrich ancestor, in its silence and grace, became a mirror of what humanity might one day become, an observer of the world, not just a participant in it. The two species did not war or compete, they simply existed side by side, each shaping the other in unseen ways. Birds' vigilance taught awareness. The human's curiosity taught adaptation. Between them, the silent exchange of evolution unfolded. As the day faded and night blanketed the savanna in darkness, the first stars pierced the sky, cold and distant. The early humans looked up, your full attention, their eyes reflecting the glittering lights above, perhaps wondering what they were, feeling both small and infinite at once. The world around them hummed softly. The chirping of insects, the distant calls of nocturnal beasts, the whisper of wind through tall grass, was a lullaby of existence, a rhythm older than time. Fires flickered faintly in the distance, casting shadows that danced upon the cave walls. Within those shadows were dreams, the first dreams of mankind, visions of the world, of the creatures they hunted, and the ones they feared. These dreams were not yet stories, but they were the beginning of imagination, the spark of culture that would one day fill the world with art, language. Thus, the early Earth stood on the edge of awakening. The sky, the rivers, the trees, the beasts, all were part of a grand symphony of life, perfect in its place. Homo habilis, small and fragile, had begun to hear that music not just with their ears, but with their minds. They were no longer mere animals. They were thinkers, dreamers, and seekers of meaning. The ostrich ancestor ran across the plains, swift and eternal, while humanity's first thoughts rose quietly into the stars. The earth was no longer just alive, it was aware, and through its creatures, was learning to understand itself. Chapter 3: The Meeting of Minds and Instinct. When the paths of Homo habilis and the giant ostrich ancestor crossed, the morning sun rose slow and heavy over the boundless savanna 3.2 million years ago, spreading a golden light across a landscape alive with motion, sound, and silence all at once. The air shimmered with heat, tall grasses swayed in endless rhythm, and the scent of wild earth filled the wind. It was a time when the earth still belonged entirely to nature, pure, untamed, and governed by instinct alone. Yet, in this ancient cradle of creation, something extraordinary was happening. Was the beginning of understanding, the quiet stirring of awareness, the moment when two separate paths of evolution, one driven by instinct, the other by thought, intertwined for the first time. On one side of this world stood Homo habilis, the earliest form of human, small and curious, their minds flickering with the first sparks of reason. On the other side roamed the giant ostrich ancestor, a creature of immense grace and power, a living emblem of survival through perfect adaptation. The story of their encounter was not written in words or remembered in history, yet it lived eternally in the deep pulse of evolution, echoing through every step that led from the wild plains to the modern human mind. The plains themselves were alive with color and motion. Herds of primitive elephants and grazing herbivores dotted the horizon, their bodies moving like waves across the endless fields. The air trembled with the sound of insects and distant calls of predators. Saber-toothed cats crouched in the tall grass. Giant crocodiles waited silently by riverbanks. Life was not cruel, but indifferent. It did not favor the weak or the strong. It only rewarded those who learned. In this vast theater of existence, every creature played its role, bound by the same unspoken law: adapt or vanish. Among them, Homo habilis had begun to rise above mere survival. They were tool-makers, fire-watchers, and silent observers of the world's hidden logic. Their small communities moved with purpose, gathering near streams and rocky shelters, their minds alert to patterns in the environment, the changing winds, the migration of herds, the growth of fruit-bearing trees. They were not fast like predators nor strong like beasts, but they were something entirely new: beings who could think about tomorrow. One morning, a pale blue sky, a small group of Homo habilis moved carefully through the tall grass, searching for food. Their sharp eyes caught movement in the distance. A shadow gliding across the plain, taller than any they had seen before. The giant ostrich ancestor, majestic and wary, its feathers glinting in the morning light like polished bronze. Its neck rose high, scanning the landscape, its sharp eyes catching every motion, every glint of danger. Its stride was elegant yet powerful, its body both delicate and strong, by nature to command the ground it walked upon. To the Homo habilis, this was no ordinary creature. It was both mystery and teacher, a being that seemed to exist beyond fear. They crouched low, whispering to one another in guttural sounds, pointing, observing. Instincts told them to stay hidden, but their curiosity pushed them forward. Slowly, one of them, a male with a scar along his cheek, moved closer, clutching a chipped stone in his hand. It was not a weapon of war, but of learning, a tool to shape, to understand. The bird noticed him, turning its long neck in his direction. Its eyes, wide and intelligent, met his. For a moment, the world fell silent. Predator and prey did not exist in that instant, only awareness. The giant ostrich ancestor took a cautious step forward, massive shadow falling over the grass. The Homo habilis did not retreat. He watched, fascinated, his heart racing not from fear but from wonder. The bird tilted its head, perhaps recognizing something unfamiliar. An awareness in the small creature, before it that mirrored its own instinctive caution, was as if two worlds were seeing each other for the first time. The world of instinct meeting the world of thought. Around them, the wind rustled through the grass, and time seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, a cry echoed in the distance, a warning call from another Homo habilis hidden nearby. The giant bird lifted its head high, alarmed, and its muscles tensed. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, it ran. The ground shook beneath its strides as it vanished into the horizon, leaving only swirling dust in its wake. Early human watched it disappear, breathing hard, feeling both awe and loss. He had seen power and peace woven together in a single being. He had seen freedom. That night, as his group gathered by the glow of a fire sparked by a storm's lightning, he held a feather he had found near the water's edge. long, strong, and iridescent. It became more than just a feather, it became a symbol, reminder of what he had witnessed. Perhaps, deep in his mind, something shifted, a realization that the world was not just a battlefield of survival, but a place of learning, where every creature held a lesson. The encounter changed the rhythm of their days. Homo habilis began to watch more closely, to mimic the alertness of the bird, the way it rid the wind, how it reacted to movement and sound. They learned to anticipate danger before it struck, to hunt with patience rather than haste. The ostrich ancestor had not spoken to them, but it had taught them something profound: the art of awareness. It showed them that power was not only in strength, but in understanding the world's patterns. Over time, these lessons became instinct of their own, passed through generations, encoded not in words but in behavior. This was how knowledge first spread, not through language, but through observation, memory, imitation. As seasons changed and years passed, Homo habilis and the giant ostrich ancestor continued to share the same plains, their lives parallel yet deeply connected. The bird's keen senses kept it alive through countless dangers, while the early humans' growing intellect began to reshape the world around them. When they crafted sharper tools, they remembered the bird's precision. When they built shelters, they recalled how the creature sought open spaces to see all that surrounded it. When they ran in rhythm with its stride. Evolution was not a race. It was a conversation, silent yet profound, between instinct and understanding. And so, as the red sun dipped below the horizon one evening, casting the sky in colors of blood and gold, the Homo habilis family watched the distant shape of the ostrich ancestor moving gracefully against the dying light. In that moment, they were no longer separate from nature. They were part of it, bound by the same pulse that drove every living thing. The giant bird disappeared into the twilight, but its presence lingered in their minds, a memory that would live on in every species that followed. It was more than an encounter. It was a moment of reflection. When the first humans looked at another creature and saw not difference, but connection, the dawn of empathy had begun, and with it, the long journey of humankind toward understanding the world not only as a place to survive, but as a mystery to be explored. Thus, the meeting of Homo habilis and the giant ostrich ancestor became not just a story of life long past, but the first chapter in the story of awareness itself, a silent exchange that changed the course of evolution forever. Chapter 4: The First Lessons of Nature, the Silent Teachers of the Ancient Earth. The sun rose over the prehistoric horizon like a slow, burning ember, its golden rays spilling across the endless plains and catching on the dew that clung to each blade of tall grass. The air was warm and still, and the land seemed to hum with life. Buzzing insects, distant calls of creatures, and the low rumble of shifting earth beneath ancient roots. 3.2 million years ago, and the world was in the midst of quiet transformation. The land that would one day be called Africa was a vast and open stage, and upon it, the first actors of thought were beginning to move with purpose. Life had already learned to survive, but now, it was learning to understand. The early morning light revealed herds of ancient herbivores grazing peacefully, while predators like saber-toothed cats watched silently from the shadows. Overhead, vultures circled lazily in the hot air currents, their wings casting dark shapes over the savanna below. Near a watering hole, a small band of Cislazard Homo habilis stirred from their resting place, rubbing sleep from their eyes, stretching their limbs, and preparing for another day of endurance and discovery. These early humans were small and vulnerable, compared to the beasts that roamed around them, but within their fragile bodies lived something that no other creature possessed. The flame of thought, the growing awareness that they could change their world. They lived not as conquerors but as apprentices to the earth. Each sunrise brought new lessons, and every sound carried meaning. The rustle of dry grass might signal a lurking predator. The sudden silence of birds might warn of danger. Their lives were woven tightly into the rhythm of the land, every action measured by instinct and curiosity. They had no words, communicated in gestures, glances, and low murmurs that spoke of hunger, caution, and wonder. For Homo habilis, every moment was a test. Every mistake could be fatal. Yet from these trials understanding bloomed. One day, while gathering stones by a riverbed, one of them discovered that a sharp, edged rock could split fruit or scrape bark more easily than bare hands. Another learned that two stones struck together could create smaller, sharper tools, or even sparks that glowed faintly when they hit against dry moss. They didn't yet know they were inventing technology, but their instincts were giving birth to reason. These were the first inventions of humankind, not of metal or fire, but of thought itself. Beyond the river, across the open grassland, another form of life embodied the ancient perfection of nature. The giant ostrich ancestor, tall and majestic, its feathers glinting like burnished copper beneath the rising sun. It was a creature built for survival, for the art of balance and speed. Its long neck swayed gently as it scanned the horizon, its eyes large and golden, capable of spotting movement from great distances. Motion was deliberate, elegant, and efficient. It needed no tools, no weapons. Its body was its strength, its instincts, its wisdom. To the Homo habilis, this creature was a symbol of power and freedom, a being that lived without fear of the predators that haunted their nights. They watched it from afar, sometimes following its tracks across the plains, not to hunt it, but to learn from it. In the bird's movements, they saw how awareness could mean survival, how attention to the world's subtle signs could make the difference between life and death. The bird's long strides taught them patience and silence. Its sharp vigilance taught them foresight. The ostrich ancestor, without knowing, became one of humanity's first silent teachers. As days passed and seasons shifted, the relationship between these two beings, the thinker and the instinctive, became a reflection of the Earth's deeper truth, that all life learns from life. When Homo habilis watched the giant bird flee before a distant roar, they began to sense the power of anticipation. When they found one of its abandoned eggs, smooth and strong, they discovered a vessel that could hold water, an idea that would one day lead to the creation of containers and tools. Nature was teaching, and humanity was listening. The lessons were not spoken, but lived, experienced through observation and repetition. In the shadows of trees, in the shimmer of heat on the plains, and in the quiet watchfulness of creatures, Homo habilis began to perceive a pattern, a system, an order in the chaos of existence. For the first time, they were not merely reacting to nature, they were beginning to interpret it. On the ancient plains was not without peril. The nights were long and full of unseen dangers. As the sun set, the temperature dropped sharply, and the cries of hunters filled the dark. Packs of wild dogs howled across the distance, their eyes glowing like embers in the blackness. The Homo habilis huddled close to one another, their bodies pressed together for warmth, their ears straining to hear the movements outside their shelters. Fire was not yet theirs to command, but they had learned to use its presence. Sometimes, when lightning struck a tree, setting it ablaze, they would linger nearby, marveling at its warmth and brightness while keeping predators at bay. They did not yet understand the nature of flame, but they knew it was a force both terrible and sacred. It was in these moments, between fear and fascination, that humanity's greatest leap began. The awareness that the world could be shaped, that it could be understood, and perhaps one day controlled. The giant ostrich ancestor also lived by the rhythm of these same dangers. It built its nests in open areas where it could see approaching predators, and it defended its eggs with powerful kicks that could shatter bone. Life was constant vigilance, a balance between motion and stillness. When the Homo habilis saw it from afar, standing proud against the orange glow of dusk, they saw not just an animal, but a teacher of endurance. In its stillness, they recognized calm movement, they recognized strategy. They began to imitate this duality, learning when to move, when to hide, when to fight, and when to wait. Silent dialogue between species, the first philosophy of survival was born. As time moved forward, as rivers changed course and storms reshaped the land, the lessons of those early days were etched into the instincts of every generation that followed. The Homo habilis passed on what they had learned, not with words, but through behavior, through example. The way a parent showed a child how to find shelter, how to read the wind, how to listen for silence that warned of predators. These were the first traditions of humanity. And across the plains, the descendants of the giant ostrich continued to run, their speed unmatched, their grace untouched, carrying forward the wisdom of instinct that had guided them for millennia. The world was vast, and every creature, from the smallest insect to the tallest bird, was part of the same endless cycle of learning and transformation. The Homo habilis, small though they were, had begun to glimpse the truth that would define all of human history. That knowledge was the most powerful form of survival. The ostrich ancestor lived by instinct alone, but it thrived because it understood, in its own way, the rhythm of life. Humanity, watching and learning, began to merge that instinct with awareness, shaping a new path that would lead far beyond the plains, into the realms of creation and imagination. And so, beneath the same sky that watched over both beast and thinker, a silent bond formed between them. A bond that would ripple through time. The early humans did not worship the bird, nor fear it, they respected it, as one respects a great truth. It was not just a creature. It was a living lesson, a symbol of nature's wisdom and resilience. As the sun sank and the stars rose over the ancient earth, Homo habilis looked to the horizon and saw the world not merely as a place to survive, but as a teacher vast and eternal. In that understanding, first chapter of knowledge was written, not in words or symbols, but in the shared breath of life itself. Chapter 5, the first spark of understanding. When curiosity became the light of survival, the wind whispered softly across the ancient African plains, carrying with it the dry scent of dust, grass, and life that had endured for millions of years. The sun rose slow and radiant over the horizon, spilling its golden warmth across a world still in its infancy. A world raw, wild, and brimming with the pulse of creation. This was Earth 3.2 million years ago, a planet ruled not by reason or civilization, but by instinct, where every sunrise was a battle between survival and extinction. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast savanna broken by winding rivers, scattered trees, and distant hills that shimmered in the heat. Herds of primitive elephants with long, curved tusks moved like gray shadows across the plains, while giant antelopes grazed quietly under the watchful eyes of predators that prowled in the tall grass. And among all these ancient forms of life, Species were beginning to define the story of evolution itself. The graceful giant ostrich ancestor, a master of instinct, emerging west Homo habilis, the first creature to hold thought in its hands like a fragile flame. This chapter unfolds at a moment when curiosity, not strength, began to shape the destiny of humankind, when the first spark of understanding flickered against the great silence of the ancient earth. The days of Homo habilis were filled with danger and discovery. Their world was unpredictable. Rains could flood the plains overnight, predators could appear from nowhere, and hunger was a constant shadow that never left their side. Yet within this hardship lay something remarkable, the birth of awareness. Each morning, as the light spread across the savannah, small groups of these early humans moved cautiously through the grass, their eyes scanning for signs of food, shelter, and threat. They carried crude tools, stones chipped to sharpness, bones shaped into simple implements. These tools were more than survival instruments, they were thoughts made tangible, ideas given form. Each time a stone struck another and splintered into a sharper edge, it echoed the first moment of creativity, the first whisper of innovation. The Homo habilis were beginning to look at the world not only for what it was but for what it could become. They watched how twigs floated on water, how shadows stretched with the sun, how fire burned but also gave warmth. Every small observation became a lesson, every lesson a step toward understanding. Meanwhile, Astas, giant ostrich ancestor, moved with the same elegance and caution that had kept its kind alive for countless generations. Its long legs carried it effortlessly across the plains, its feathers glinting like bronze beneath the blazing sky. It did not think in the way Homo habilis did, but it knew the earth's moods, the changing winds, the scents that foretold danger. Its survival was written in its bones, in instincts honed by millennia of evolution. It did not question why the world worked as it did, it simply moved in harmony with it. Its life was a perfect balance between motion and stillness, between fear and freedom. The observing eyes of Homo habilis, the great bird, was not prey. It was a mystery, a creature that seemed to know secrets of the land they were only beginning to understand. One bright morning, a group of Homo habilis stumbled upon a clearing where the grass had been flattened and the air smelled faintly of eggs and earth. There, buried in the dust, lay several massive eggs, each the size of a small boulder. They were the eggs of the giant ostrich ancestor, smooth, strong, gleaming under the sunlight. The early humans approached carefully, their curiosity greater than their hunger. One of them, a young female, crouched beside an egg, touching its hard surface with wonder. Her mind, though primitive, was alive with questions she could not voice. What was inside? Could it be eaten, or was it something sacred? Around her, others gathered, their dark eyes reflecting the shimmering light. This was not the first time they had seen such eggs, but this time something was different. This time, they were not just observing nature, studying it. A sudden sound broke their concentration. The sharp call of a bird carried by the wind. They looked up and saw her, the mother, the giant ostrich ancestor herself, towering and magnificent, her feathers catching the sunlight as she stood at a distance, watching them with cautious intelligence. For a moment, neither moved. The bird took a slow, deliberate step forward, her head high, her gaze fixed upon the intruders. The humans froze not out of fear but awe. The female Homo habilis, who had touched the egg, lowered her hand and backed away slightly, sensing the creature's protective vigilance. Ostrich gave a low, vibrating call, a sound that resonated through the air like a heartbeat. It was not a sound of aggression, but of warning, a reminder that the world belonged not only to one kind of life, but to all. The group watched as the bird approached her nest, carefully inspecting each egg before settling beside them. The humans did not attack, nor did they flee. They simply stood there, silent witnesses to a ritual older than time, the dance of survival, the rhythm of care, the instinct of life itself. When the humans finally retreated, they carried with them more than the memory of that encounter. They carried understanding, the realization that other beings lived with purpose and meaning, that the earth was not theirs alone to take, but to share. That night, as they gathered beneath a canopy of stars, the group sat quietly near a dying fire. The wind rustled through the grass, and the scent of smoke drifted upward into the dark. The young female held a broken piece of eggshell she had taken from the nest's edge. She examined it closely, running her fingers along its smooth curve, fascinated by its strength and fragility. In that small fragment lay the first glimmer of thought beyond survival, curiosity, reflection, and wonder. Perhaps she would later use it to carry water, or to store berries. Perhaps she would simply keep it as a symbol. She did not yet know what symbols meant. Either way, she had taken her first step toward imagination. The ability to see the world not as it was, as it could be. The earth, too, seemed to notice. The stars above gleamed brighter, and the wind sang softly through the grass, as if whispering approval. The fire flickered, casting shadows that danced like spirits against the ground. Within those shadows, the faces of Homo habilis glowed with light and thought, the earliest reflection of humankind's destiny. They had begun to look inward, ask silent questions, to see connections between themselves and the world around them. They were no longer simply reacting to life, they were beginning to interpret it. And somewhere far in the distance, the giant ostrich ancestor rested beneath the moonlight, her chicks stirring within their shells, waiting to enter the same world of danger and discovery. Thus, the first spark of understanding had been kindled, not through words or fire, but through curiosity. The unspoken force that drives all creation. The meeting between Homo habilis and the ostrich ancestor was not an act of conflict or dominance, but one of revelation. Each had something the other lacked. Bird had instinct perfected, and the human had the power to imagine beyond instinct. Together, they represented the two halves of life's eternal wisdom. The knowing and the seeking, the being and the becoming. From that day forward, the Homo habilis would look at the world differently. Every leaf, every sound, every creature became a teacher. Your full attention. They had begun to understand that the earth was not just their home, it was their guide. And in that understanding lay the first true dawn of humanity, the beginning of the long journey from survival to wisdom, from instinct to consciousness, from curiosity to civilization. As Chapter 6, The Echo of Fire. Light divided the darkness. The world was silent before dawn, a deep and ancient stillness covering the land like a veil. The sky, painted in hues of indigo and silver, waited for the first breath of light to touch the sleeping earth. Around a cluster of large boulders, hidden among tall grasses and thorny shrubs, a small group of Homo habilis huddled together in the cold. Their breaths came out in soft clouds, mingling with the mist that rose from the nearby river. The night had been long, cruel, and merciless, filled with the growls of distant predators and the rustling of unseen creatures moving through the dark. Amidst this endless cycle of fear and endurance, something had changed. For the first time, the darkness was not absolute. your full attention. A faint glow flickered near the center of their small camp, casting trembling shadows across the rough stone walls. Was not the glow of the moon nor the reflection of starlight. It was fire. Born of accident and wonder, the fire crackled softly, its orange tongues licking at the dry wood, its warmth spreading like a miracle. The Homo habilis stared in silence, their eyes wide, and filled with both awe and confusion. They did not yet understand what this thing was, this living light that danced and consumed, that brought warmth yet threatened to burn. But in that fragile circle of light, something profound had awakened, the beginning of control over nature itself. The discovery had not been intentional. A storm had swept across the plains days earlier, its thunder rolling like the voice of the gods and lightning tearing through the clouds. One bolt had struck a tree, setting it ablaze, and when the storm passed, the charred wood continued to glow faintly. Drawn by curiosity and the lingering scent of smoke, a few Homo habilis had approached the site. The heat frightened them at first, but fascination soon overcame fear. They watched how the fire moved, how it breathed with the wind, how it turned wood to ash and light. One of them, braver than the rest, had taken a smoldering branch and carried it back to their shelter. The fire nearly died on the journey, but a gust of wind revived it. When they placed dry grass near its base, it sprang back to life. Now, sitting around this flickering wonder, something no creature had ever felt before, a sense of power. The night, once a realm of unseen terrors, now bent before their light. The cold, which had bitten at their skin and bones, now retreated before their warmth. For the first time, they could stand against the world not as victims of its fury, but as students of its secrets. This giant ostrich ancestor, far across the plain, sensed the change in the air as well. Its keen eyes, adapted to daylight and distance, caught a strange orange shimmer on the horizon where none had been before. The bird tilted its long neck, listening to the wind that carried with it the scent of smoke. Instinctively, it avoided the area. Fire was nature's destroyer, an unpredictable force that devoured everything in its path. To the ostrich, fire was danger, a signal to flee. Yet for the Homo habilis, it was the opposite. It was a symbol of survival. The two species stood at a crossroads of evolution, one guided by instinct that avoided change, the other driven by curiosity that embraced it. The ostrich moved away, disappearing into the distance, while the humans gathered closer, their faces painted with the orange glow of discovery. The flickering flame reflected in their eyes was more than just light. It was the birth of awareness that they could command nature, shape it, and use it for their will. The fire became their teacher, a force both merciful and cruel. When they fed it with dry leaves and twigs, brighter and stronger, crackling with energy. When they neglected it, it dimmed and withered away, began to notice its needs, the rhythm of feeding, the balance between fuel and air. It was alive in a way they could understand. Soon, they learned that certain woods burned longer, that stones could shield its embers from the wind, that smoke carried smells that frightened away predators. The night beasts that had once ruled the darkness now kept their distance. The glowing light had become a wall, a sacred barrier between life and death. Within its circle, Homo habilis found a new kind of peace. They could sleep without constant fear, share food, and observe the stars. Around this small miracle, their society began to take shape, not through language, but through shared experience. The fire became their center, their first hearth, first symbol of unity. In the days that followed, they began to experiment. One individual accidentally dropped a piece of meat near the fire. Smell that rose from it was intoxicating, rich, smoky, and warm. When he dared to taste it, he found it softer, easier to chew, and more satisfying. The others soon followed, and thus the first cooked meal in human history was shared beneath the pale blue dawn. The act was simple, but its consequences were profound. The nourishment from cooked food gave them more energy, sharper minds, and stronger bodies. Over generations, this would lead to the growth of the human brain and the rise of thought itself. Fire had not only given warmth, it had begun to shape their evolution. No longer just a tool, it was destiny. Yet with every gift came a lesson in balance. One evening, when the winds grew strong, the fire spread beyond its stones, setting the dry grass ablaze. Panic rippled through the group as the flames roared upward, devouring the ground in moments. They ran, clutching one another, their cries echoing through the night. The fire that had once protected them now hunted them. They fled into the river, watching helplessly as their shelter and tools turned to smoke. When the flames finally died, only ash and silence remained. In the aftermath, they approached the burned land cautiously, their faces marked with soot and fear. They had learned their first great lesson, that power without respect leads to destruction. Still, even in their fear, they knew they could not abandon it. Fire was both creation and chaos, and they would have to learn to live with both. The days grew shorter and the nights colder. Once again, they kindled the flame, this time with more care and reverence. They guarded it like a living spirit, passing its embers from one fire to the next, allowing it to die completely. In its light, they began to see not just their surroundings, but each other. They started to mimic sounds, gestures, expressions, laying the foundation of communication. Around the fire, they shared moments of silence that meant something more than fear. Something like belonging. The flame reflected in their eyes became a symbol of shared purpose. It was here that humanity's first sense of community was born. Far away, under the vast African sky, the giant ostrich ancestor slept in its nest, unaware of the magnitude of what had occurred. The light that now glowed faintly across the plains was not just an accident of nature. It was the birth of civilization's heartbeat. The Homo habilis had taken the first step toward becoming masters of their world, not by strength, but by understanding. Fire had become their companion, their protector, and their greatest teacher. It would follow them through the ages, from stone to bronze, from cave to city, from fear to knowledge. And so, as the stars wheeled silently above, the first fire burned steadily against the night, its glow marking the boundary between beast and being, between darkness and dawn. The early humans sat close, their faces soft with warmth, their minds flickering with thought. The fire crackled like a whisper of destiny, and in that ancient sound lay the promise of everything that would come. The promise of creation, destruction, memory, and light. Humanity had found its spark, and the earth, for the first time, had learned to shine from within. Chapter 7, The First Hunt. When instinct met strategy. The morning sun rose like molten gold over the vast savanna, spreading warmth across the endless stretch of tall grass that swayed gently in the wind. The air shimmered with heat, scent of wildflowers mingled with the musky odor of life and death that defined this prehistoric world. It was 3.2 million years ago. Earth pulsed with energy. Herds of giant antelopes thundered across the plains, lions and saber-toothed cats stalked the shadows, vultures circled patiently overhead, waiting for the weak to fall. Among these creatures, the wise Homo habilis moved cautiously, neither predator nor prey, caught in the delicate balance between survival and extinction. They were smaller than many of the beasts that surrounded them, yet something invisible set them apart, a spark of thought, a whisper of intention. They had already learned to use tools, to gather, protect themselves with fire, but now they were standing on the edge of a new discovery. The hunt. Until this moment, they had scavenged what the land offered: fruits, roots, insects, and the remains left by stronger hunters. But hunger had become a relentless teacher, and curiosity its stern companion. When they watched the lions hunt, when they saw the vultures wait for death, a new idea began to form within their primitive minds. The idea that they, too, could take life not by accident, but by design. The day began with hunger. The small band of Homo habilis, 5 adults and 2 juveniles, awoke beneath the shade of a large acacia tree. Their stomachs growled with emptiness, bodies weak from days of scarce food. The rains had ended, and the dry season had hardened the ground. The fruits were fewer, roots more difficult to dig, and the nearby rivers had shrunk to muddy pools. As the sun climbed higher, they watched a herd of small antelopes graze by the water's edge. The animals were cautious but peaceful, their ears flicking at the faintest sound. One of the older Homo habilis, a male with sharp eyes and a face marked by scars, crouched low behind the grass, watching intently. His breath was slow, body tense. Something stirred within him. A thought, an instinct sharpened by necessity. He picked up a long branch that had fallen nearby, stripped it of leaves, and tested its weight. He had seen a lion strike, seen the force with which a claw or tooth could kill. Now, he mimicked that motion, swinging the stick downward with a grunt. The others watched him curiously. In that simple act, a pattern was born. Imitation turned into strategy. Hours passed as the group followed the herd from a distance, observing their movements, the way they scattered when alarmed and the paths they took toward water. The Homo habilis began to coordinate in silence, communicating with gestures and glances. They had no language, yet their shared hunger spoke louder than words. Older male pointed toward a narrow section of the riverbank, where the ground was soft, and the herd often slowed. He motioned for the others to move there, circling wide through the grass. This was not a conscious plan, as humans would know it today, but a natural coordination born from intuition and shared need. As the sun began to fall toward the horizon, the shadows grew longer, and the air cooled. The herd gathered near the water, unaware of the small shapes creeping closer through the grass. The Homo habilis crouched low, hearts pounding, their crude stone tools clutched tightly in trembling hands. When one antelope strayed from the group, the older male gave a soft grunt, the signal. An explosion of motion, they surged forward, shouting guttural cries to startle the prey. The herd bolted, hooves pounding like thunder. One young antelope slipped on the muddy bank. In that instant, the first hunt began. The Homo habilis descended upon the struggling animal with desperate ferocity. Their stone tools struck clumsily, but effectively, cutting and stabbing in chaotic rhythm. The antelope kicked and thrashed, its cries piercing the air, echoing through the plains. The struggle was brutal and brief, and when it ended, silence returned, except for their heavy breathing and the soft buzz of flies already gathering. They stared at the lifeless form before them, panting, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. None of them spoke, but their eyes were wide with realization. They had taken life, not scavenged what remained, not stolen from another predator, but hunted, by their own will. It was an act of both violence and awakening, a moment that would change the course of evolution forever. They did not yet understand it. This was the first moment humanity became a true participant in the balance of life and death. As the group began to cut the flesh with their tools, the smell of blood filled the air, sharp, metallic, intoxicating. The younger members approached hesitantly, their curiosity mixed with fear. Older male tore a piece of meat and tasted it raw. His face twisted, then relaxed as the rich taste filled his mouth. He gestured for the others to eat, and soon they were sharing the kill, consuming the reward of their effort. The nourishment surged through their bodies, giving them new strength. Around them, the plains continued as always. Predators prowled, birds soared, insects buzzed. But something invisible had shifted. The Homo habilis had taken their first step into dominance. The act of the hunt would become their inheritance, their symbol of cooperation and intelligence. The first time, survival was not just a reaction, it was an achievement. But the victory was not without danger. As they fed, the scent of blood drew the attention of others. A low growl echoed from the shadows. Out of the tall grass emerged a pair of saber-toothed cats, massive fangs gleaming in the fading light. The Homo habilis froze, their triumph turning instantly to terror. The older male stood, gripping his stick, shouted, a deep, resonant sound that carried authority. The others followed his lead, waving branches, hurling stones, and shouting louder. The cats paused, snarling, their muscles coiled to strike. Firelight might have saved them, but there was none here. Only courage and instinct. For long moments, predator and prey faced each other, until the cats, sensing the strange unity of their would-be victims, decided the risk was too great. With a final growl, they retreated into the dark, leaving the early humans trembling but alive. The group clung together, breathing heavily, their eyes reflecting the faint red of the setting sun. In that moment, they realized the strength of unity, the power of acting together as one. That night, they carried what remained of their kill back to their shelter near the river. The stars watched silently as they gathered around the glowing embers of their fire. The meat roasted slowly, the fat sizzling, sending fragrant smoke into the air. They ate, not only to fill their stomachs, but to celebrate an unspoken triumph. Each bite was a memory, a confirmation that they could change their fate. The younger ones mimicked the chase, playfully waving sticks and growling, while the elders sat in quiet contemplation. The firelight danced across their faces, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of the future. Across the plains, the giant ostrich ancestor rested under the moonlight, unaware of the transformation taking place nearby. The balance of life had subtly shifted. A new kind of predator had entered the world, not one of claw or tooth, but of mind. The night grew deep and still. The Homo habilis slept in the warmth of the fire, their bellies full, their dreams stirred by the echoes of the hunt. Their minds flickered images of pursuit and triumph, of strength found through thought. The fire crackled softly beside them, the stars glimmered overhead. Somewhere, the wind carried the faint, distant cry of an ostrich echoing through the dark, was a reminder that life would always move in cycles. Hunter and hunted, light and shadow, instinct and reason. But for humanity, this day marked the dawn of a new age. They had learned not only to survive, but to act, to imagine, to plan. And in that single act of deliberate pursuit, they had crossed a threshold that no other creature would ever cross. From that day forward, the earth would remember their footsteps. Future would belong to those who could dream before they struck. Chapter 8: The Great Migration. When the earth became a map of dreams, the wind carried the scent of distant rain. As the dawn crept slowly over the horizon, the savanna in shades of bronze and gold. The air was cool, filled with the soft murmurs of life awakening. Buzzing insects, rustling grass, distant calls of unseen creatures. The world 3.2 million years ago was both magnificent and merciless, a realm where survival demanded constant movement. The Homo habilis, once confined to small territories of safety and familiarity, had begun to feel a stirring deep within their collective instinct. A restlessness that no shelter could contain. Food was growing scarce. The rivers were shrinking, and the once plentiful herds had followed the changing rains farther north. Something within these early humans urged them to follow as well, to leave behind the lands of their birth and step into the unknown. This was no simple wandering, it was the beginning of the first great migration. A journey that would shape the destiny of their kind forever. The same wide African sky, another ancient creature watched them from afar. This giant ostrich ancestor, whose long strides had once defined the rhythm of the plains. Like the humans, it too followed the rains, its instincts guiding it across vast distances. While the bird moved because it had to, the Homo habilis began to move because they've chosen to. That difference, invisible yet monumental, marked the first moment when instinct began to evolve into imagination. The plains were no longer safe. The long dry season had turned the rivers into cracked ribbons of clay, and the grass that once brushed their knees now lay brittle and grey beneath the sun. The wind carried dust instead of life, and hunger pressed heavily upon their bodies. The small band of Homo habilis gathered beneath a withered tree one morning, their faces gaunt but their eyes determined. They had watched the herds disappear beyond the horizon, the same way they had watched birds migrate in great sweeping arcs across the sky. Perhaps, they thought in their wordless way, food could be found where those creatures went. Perhaps water still flowed somewhere beyond the hills. Driven by that fragile hope, they began to walk. The first few days were hard, their feet blistered and sore, their pace slow and uncertain. They moved along the edge of a dry riverbed, carrying crude tools and bundles of grass, wrapped fruit, their eyes always scanning for signs of water or prey. The land stretched endlessly ahead, rolling hills, scattered trees, and shimmering heat mirages that seemed to dance in the distance. The journey was exhausting, yet the rhythm of walking became its own kind of language, a steady drumbeat of survival that echoed across the earth. Day brought new challenges. They crossed open plains where the sun burned without mercy and nights so cold that the wind cut through their thin hair and skin like knives. They learned to rest in caves, to cover themselves with leaves or animal hides for warmth, and to follow the stars when the landscape offered no path. The stars themselves became silent companions, points of light that seemed to whisper guidance from above. Though they could not understand them, the Homo habilis felt their pull, the faint awareness of direction, of purpose. They began to remember landmarks: a tall tree near a river bend, a cluster of rocks shaped like a sleeping beast, a distant mountain whose peak always pointed them toward the rains. These memories were not yet maps, but they were the beginnings of one, the first fragile traces of human geography forming within the mind. For the first time, they were not bound to one place. They were explorers, seekers, moving in rhythm with the pulse of the planet. During their migration, they encountered landscapes unlike any they had ever seen. They walked through forests dense with sound, where monkeys shrieked and birds with bright feathers darted between the leaves. They crossed rocky plateaus where the wind screamed through narrow canyons, carrying the scent of salt and stone. Sometimes they found abundance, fruit hanging heavy from trees, pools of fresh water glistening under the sun. At other times, they found only emptiness, where every sound was the echo of their own footsteps. The world tested them with cruelty and rewarded them with wonder, teaching them that survival was not just a battle, but a relationship with the earth itself. As they moved, they began to change. Their muscles grew stronger, their minds sharper. They learned to read the land as if it were a story written in tracks and shadows. The broken branch that meant an animal had passed, sudden silence that warned of predators nearby. They were becoming travelers not only in body but in thought. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of crimson light, they came upon a wide valley. At its center stood a small herd of elephants drinking from a pool fed by an underground spring. Around the edges of the water grew lush grass and blooming flowers, and the scent of life filled the air. For days they had walked through dust and death, and now, before them, was abundance. The group approached carefully, waiting until the elephants moved away before drinking and bathing in the cool water. For the first time in weeks, they rested without fear. The night sky glittered with stars. The fire they built cast long shadows that danced upon the ground. The children played beside the flames, throwing handfuls of dust into the air, watching it sparkle in the light. The elders stared into the fire's heart, lost in the rhythm of its movement. Around that fire, kind of awareness took root. They had not just survived, they had traveled and endured together. The journey itself had become part of their identity, a shared memory that bound them as a group, as a family. Far across the plain, Shrek's giant ostrich ancestor slept in its nest of grass and feathers. It too had followed the changing rains, long strides tracing paths that crossed the same land the humans now walked. It had survived through instinct, patterns written in its blood since the dawn of time. The Homo habilis, however, were breaking free from those invisible chains. They began to move not because the earth commanded them, but because they had learned to interpret it. They could look at the horizon and imagine what might lie beyond. They could see the movement of clouds and predict the coming of storms. Each step forward carried not only their bodies, but the weight of thought itself, the birth of foresight. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. They crossed rivers, climbed ridges, and faced storms that tore the sky apart with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they lost members to hunger or exhaustion, yet they pressed onward, driven by the shared rhythm of survival and hope. Along the way, they encountered new creatures, large flightless birds that resembled the ostrich ancestor, herds of strange antelopes with curved horns, predators whose glowing eyes haunted the nights. Every encounter left an imprint, a lesson carved into memory. Slowly, these lessons became stories, though they had no words to tell them yet. A gesture toward the stars might recall the time they followed their light. A scratch on a stone might represent a mountain past. The beginnings of storytelling were born in these migrations, not as spoken language, but as shared remembrance. When they finally reached the northern plains, where the grass was greener and the rivers wider, they paused at the edge of a great plateau. Below them stretched a land rich and alive, filled with the promise of renewal. The air was cooler, the scent of rain stronger. They had arrived in a place where they could rest, at least for a time. The band stood together, gazing out across the landscape, their eyes reflecting the light of the rising sun. In that moment, they were more than survivors. They were travelers, pioneers, the first dreamers of the earth. Behind them lay the bones of the past, and before them, the vastness of possibility. That night, As the fire burned low and the stars shimmered above, a quiet understanding passed between them. A feeling that the earth was vast but connected, that every path led somewhere new. The paths Homo habilis had begun their first great migration, and in doing so, they had unknowingly written the first chapter of humanity's endless journey. They had turned the land itself into a living map, drawn not with ink or stone, but with footsteps and dreams. The giant ostrich ancestor still roamed the plains, following the pulse of nature, but humankind had begun to follow something else. The call of curiosity, the voice of the unknown. And from that restless impulse would one day rise all of civilization, exploration, and discovery, for in their wandering hearts burned the first dream of a world without boundaries. Chapter 8: The Great Migration. When the earth became a map of dreams, the wind carried the scent of distant rain as the dawn crept slowly over the horizon, the savanna in shades of bronze and gold. The air was cool, filled with the soft murmurs of life awakening. Buzzing insects, rustling grass, the distant calls of unseen creatures. The world 3.2 million years ago was both magnificent and merciless, a realm where survival demanded constant movement. The ex-Homo habilis, once confined to small territories of safety and familiarity, had begun to feel a stirring deep within their collective instinct, a restlessness that no shelter could contain. Food was growing scarce, the rivers were shrinking, and the once plentiful herds had followed the changing rains farther north. Something within these early humans urged them to follow as well, to leave behind the lands of their birth and step into the unknown. This was no simple wandering, it was the beginning of the first great migration. A journey that would shape the destiny of their kind forever. Beneath the same wide African sky, another ancient creature watched them from afar. The giant ostrich ancestor. Long strides had once defined the rhythm of the plains. Like the humans, it too followed the rains, its instincts guiding it across vast distances. While the bird moved because it had to, the Homo habilis began to move because they chose to. That difference, invisible yet monumental, marked the first moment when instinct began to evolve into imagination. The plains were no longer safe. The long dry season had turned the rivers into cracked ribbons of clay, and the grass that once brushed their knees now lay brittle and gray beneath the sun. The wind carried dust instead of life, and hunger pressed heavily upon their bodies. The small band of Homo habilis gathered beneath a withered tree one morning, their faces gaunt, but their eyes determined. They had watched the herds disappear beyond the horizon, the same way they had watched birds migrate in great sweeping arcs across the sky. Perhaps, they thought in their wordless way, food could be found where those creatures went. Perhaps water still flowed somewhere beyond the hills. Driven by that fragile hope, they began to walk. The first few days were hard, their feet blistered and sore, their pace slow and uncertain. They moved along the edge of a dry riverbed, carrying crude tools and bundles of grass, wrapped fruit, their eyes always scanning for signs of water or prey. The land stretched endlessly ahead, rolling hills, scattered trees, and shimmering heat mirages that seemed to dance in the distance. The journey was exhausting, yet the rhythm of walking became its own kind of language, a steady drumbeat of survival that echoed across the earth. Day brought new challenges. They crossed open plains, where the sun burned without mercy, and nights so cold that the wind cut through their thin hair and skin like knives. They learned to rest in caves, to cover themselves with leaves or animal hides for warmth, and to follow the stars when the landscape offered no path. The stars themselves became silent companions, points of light that seemed to whisper guidance from above. Though they could not understand them, the Homo habilis felt their pull, the faint awareness of direction, of purpose. They began to remember landmarks: a tall tree near a river bend, a cluster of rocks shaped like a sleeping beast, a distant mountain whose peak always pointed them toward the rains. These memories were not yet maps, but they were the beginnings of the first fragile traces of human geography forming within the mind. For the first time, they were not bound to one place. They were explorers, seekers, moving in rhythm with the pulse of the planet. During their migration, they encountered landscapes unlike any they had ever seen. They walked through forests dense with sound, where monkeys shrieked and birds with bright feathers darted between the leaves. They crossed rocky plateaus, where the wind screamed through narrow canyons, carrying the scent of salt and stone. Sometimes they found abundance, fruit hanging heavy from trees, pools of fresh water glistening under the sun. At other times, they found only emptiness, where every sound was the echo of their own footsteps. The world tested them with cruelty and rewarded them with wonder, teaching them that survival was not just a battle, but a relationship with the earth itself. As they moved, they began to change. Their muscles grew stronger, their minds sharper. They learned to read the land as if it were a story written in tracks and shadows. The broken branch that meant an animal had passed, the sudden silence that warned of predators nearby. They were becoming travelers not only in body but in thought. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of crimson light, they came upon a wide valley. At its center stood a small herd of elephants drinking from a pool fed by an underground spring. Around the edges of the water grew lush grass and blooming flowers, and the scent of life filled the air. For days they had walked through dust and death, and now, before them, was abundance. The group approached carefully, waiting until the elephants moved away before drinking and bathing in the cool water. The first time in weeks, they rested without fear. The night sky glittered with stars. The fire they built cast long shadows that danced upon the ground. The children played beside the flames, throwing handfuls of dust into the air, watching it sparkle in the light. The elders stared into the fire's heart, lost in the rhythm of its movement. Around that fire, a new kind of awareness took root. They had not just survived, they had traveled and endured together. The journey itself had become part of their identity, a shared memory that bound them as a group, as a family. Far across the plain, Kaa's giant ostrich ancestor slept in its nest of grass and feathers. It too had followed the changing rains, its long strides tracing paths that crossed the same land the humans now walked. It had survived through instinct, patterns written in its blood since the dawn of time. The Homo habilis, however, were breaking free from those invisible chains. They began to move not because the earth commanded them, but because they had learned to interpret it. They could look at the horizon and imagine what might lie beyond. They could see the movement of clouds and predict the coming of storms. Each step forward carried not only their bodies but the weight of thought itself. The birth of foresight. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. They crossed rivers, climbed ridges, and faced storms that tore the sky apart with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they lost members to hunger or exhaustion, yet they pressed onward, driven by the shared rhythm of survival and hope. Along the way, they encountered new creatures, large flightless birds that resembled the ostrich ancestor, herds of strange antelopes with curved horns, predators whose glowing eyes haunted the nights. Every encounter left an imprint, a lesson carved into memory. Slowly, These lessons became stories, though they had no words to tell them yet. A gesture toward the stars might recall the time they followed their light. A scratch on a stone might represent a mountain past. The beginnings of storytelling were born in these migrations, not as spoken language, as shared remembrance. When they finally reached the northern plains, where the grass was greener and the rivers wider, they paused at the edge of a great plateau. Below them stretched a land rich and alive, filled with the promise of renewal. The air was cooler, the scent of rain stronger. They had arrived in a place where they could rest, at least for a time. The band stood together, gazing out across the landscape, their eyes reflecting the light of the rising sun. In that moment, they were more than survivors. They were travelers, pioneers, the first dreamers of the earth. Behind them lay the bones of the past, and before them, the vastness of possibility. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars shimmered above, a quiet understanding passed between them. A feeling that the earth was vast but connected, path led somewhere new. The vast Homo habilis had begun their first great migration, and in doing so, they had unknowingly written the first chapter of humanity's endless journey. They had turned the land itself into a living map, drawn not with ink or stone, but with footsteps and dreams. The giant ostrich ancestor still roamed the plains, following the pulse of nature, but humankind had begun to follow something else. The call of curiosity, the voice of the unknown. And from that restless impulse would one day rise all of civilization, exploration, and discovery. In their wandering hearts burned the first dream of a world without boundaries. Chapter 8: The Great Migration. When the earth became a map of dreams, the wind carried the scent of distant rain as the dawn crept slowly over the horizon, the savanna in shades of bronze and gold. The air was cool, filled with the soft murmurs of life awakening. Buzzing insects, rustling grass, distant calls of unseen creatures. The world 3.2 million years ago was both magnificent and merciless, a realm where survival demanded constant movement. The Homo habilis, once confined to small territories of safety and familiarity, had begun to feel a stirring deep within their collective instinct, a restlessness that no shelter could contain. Food was growing scarce. The rivers were shrinking, and the once plentiful herds had followed the changing rains farther north. Something within these early humans urged them to follow as well, to leave behind the lands of their birth and step into the unknown. This was no simple wandering, it was the beginning of the first great migration. A journey that would shape the destiny of their kind forever. Beneath the same wide African sky, another ancient creature watched them from afar. The giant ostrich ancestor. Long strides had once defined the rhythm of the plains. Like the humans, it too followed the rains, its instincts guiding it across vast distances. But while the bird moved because it had to, the Homo habilis began to move because they've chose to. That difference, invisible yet monumental, marked the first moment when instinct began to evolve into imagination. The plains were no longer safe. The long dry season had turned the rivers into cracked ribbons of clay, and the grass that once brushed their knees now lay brittle and gray beneath the sun. Wind carried dust instead of life, and hunger pressed heavily upon their bodies. The small band of Homo habilis gathered beneath a withered tree one morning, their faces gaunt, but their eyes determined. They had watched the herds disappear beyond the horizon, the same way they had watched birds migrate in great sweeping arcs across the sky. Perhaps, they thought in their wordless way, food could be found where those creatures went. Perhaps water still flowed somewhere beyond the hills. Driven by that fragile hope, they began to walk. The first few days were hard, their feet blistered and sore, their pace slow and uncertain. They moved along the edge of a dry riverbed, carrying crude tools and bundles of grass. Wrapped fruit, their eyes always scanning for signs of water or prey. Land stretched endlessly ahead, rolling hills, scattered trees, and shimmering heat mirages that seemed to dance in the distance. The journey was exhausting, yet the rhythm of walking became its own kind of language, a steady drumbeat of survival that echoed across the earth. Each day brought new challenges. They crossed open plains where the sun burned without mercy and nights so cold that the wind cut through their thin hair and skin like knives. They learned to rest in caves, to cover themselves with leaves or animal hides for warmth, and to follow the stars when the landscape offered no path. The stars themselves became silent companions, points of light that seemed to whisper guidance from above. Though they could not understand them, the Homo habilis felt their pull, the faint awareness of direction, of purpose. They began to remember landmarks: a tall tree near a river bend, a cluster of rocks shaped like a sleeping beast, a distant mountain whose peak always pointed them toward the rains. These memories were not yet maps, but they were the beginnings of one, the first fragile traces of human geography forming within the mind. For the first time, they were not bound to one place. They were explorers, seekers, moving in rhythm with the pulse of the planet. During their migration, they encountered landscapes unlike any they had ever seen. They walked through forests dense with sound, where monkeys shrieked and birds with bright feathers darted between the leaves. They crossed rocky plateaus, where the wind screamed through narrow canyons, carrying the scent of salt and stone. Sometimes they found abundance: fruit hanging heavy from trees, pools of fresh water glistening under the sun. At other times they found only emptiness, where every sound was the echo of their own footsteps. The world tested them with cruelty and rewarded them with wonder, teaching them that survival was not just a battle, but a relationship with the earth itself. As they moved, they began to change. Their muscles grew stronger, their minds sharper. They learned to read the land as if it were a story written in tracks and shadows. The broken branch that meant an animal had passed, sudden silence that warned of predators nearby. They were becoming travelers not only in body but in thought. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of crimson light, they came upon a wide valley. At its center stood a small herd of elephants drinking from a pool fed by an underground spring. Around the edges of the water grew lush grass and blooming flowers, and the scent of life filled the air. For days they had walked through dust and death, and now, before them, was abundance. The group approached carefully, waiting until the elephants moved away before drinking and bathing in the cool water. For the first time in weeks, they rested without fear. The night sky glittered with stars, and the fire they built cast long shadows that danced upon the ground. The children played beside the flames, throwing handfuls of dust into the air, watching it sparkle in the light. The elders stared into the fire's heart, lost in the rhythm of its movement. Around that fire, kind of awareness took root. They had not just survived, they had traveled and endured together. The journey itself had become part of their identity, a shared memory that bound them as a group, as a family. Far across the plain, giant ostrich ancestor slept in its nest of grass and feathers. It too had followed the changing rains, its long strides tracing paths that crossed the same land the humans now walked. It had survived through instinct, patterns written in its blood since the dawn of time. The Homo habilis, however, were breaking free from those invisible chains. They began to move not because the earth commanded them, but because they had learned to interpret it. They could look at the horizon and imagine what might lie beyond. They could see the movement of clouds and predict the coming of storms. Each step forward carried not only their bodies, but the weight of thought itself. The birth of foresight. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. They crossed rivers, climbed ridges, and faced storms that tore the sky apart with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they lost members to hunger or exhaustion, yet they pressed onward, driven by the shared rhythm of survival and hope. Along the way, they encountered new creatures, large flightless birds that resembled the ostrich ancestor, herds of strange antelopes with curved horns, predators whose glowing eyes haunted the nights. Every encounter left an imprint, a lesson carved into memory. Slowly, these lessons became stories, though they had no words to tell them yet. A gesture toward the stars might recall the time they followed their light. A scratch on a stone might represent a mountain past. The beginnings of storytelling were born in these migrations, not as spoken language, as shared remembrance. When they finally reached the northern plains, where the grass was greener and the rivers wider, they paused at the edge of a great plateau. Below them stretched a land rich and alive, filled with the promise of renewal. The air was cooler, scent of rain stronger. They had arrived in a place where they could rest, at least for a time. The band stood together, gazing out across the landscape, their eyes reflecting the light of the rising sun. In that moment, they were more than survivors. They were travelers, pioneers, first dreamers of the earth. Behind them lay the bones of the past, and before them, the vastness of possibility. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars shimmered above, a quiet understanding passed between them. A feeling that the earth was vast but connected, that every path led somewhere new. The Homo habilis had begun their first great migration, and in doing so, they had unknowingly written the first chapter of humanity's endless journey. They had turned the land itself into a living map, drawn not with ink or stone, but with footsteps and dreams. The giant ostrich ancestor still roamed the plains, following the pulse of nature, but humankind had begun to follow something else. The call of curiosity, the voice of the unknown. And from that restless impulse would one day rise all of civilization, exploration, and discovery. In their wandering hearts burned the first dream of a world without boundaries. Chapter 9, The Dawn of Understanding. When Homo habilis looked beyond survival. The morning sun rose over the golden plains, its warmth spilling across the earth like molten light, touching everything with the promise of another day of struggle and hope. The world was alive with movement. Creatures grazing, predators hunting, soft hum of insects filling the still air. But something unseen, something extraordinary, was beginning to stir within one species. The Homo habilis, small and seemingly fragile against the vastness of their world, were awakening to more than just the rhythm of survival. For countless generations, they had lived by instinct: hunt, gather, flee, sleep. But now, for the first time, thought itself began to take shape, not as fleeting sparks, but as fire that could be tended and kept alive. Their minds were expanding like the horizon after a storm, toward things unseen and ideas unspoken. On this ancient landscape, a revolution of awareness was quietly unfolding, one that would one day separate the human lineage from every other creature to walk the earth. It began not with tools or fire, with wonder. a strange and powerful curiosity that compelled them to look, to question, to imagine. Your full attention. As the band of Homo habilis moved across the plains, they began to notice the patterns of the world around them. The giant ostrich ancestors migrated in graceful lines, always moving toward the rains. The great cats waited until dusk to hunt. The sky itself shifted in colors and moods that foretold change. The Homo habilis began to see that life moved in cycles, that the same stars appeared again and again in the same places, that certain trees bore fruit after certain rains. In these small recognitions, understanding was born. One of them, a young female with keen eyes, began to collect certain stones. Not because she needed them for tools, but because their colors fascinated her. She turned them in her hand, watching how they caught the sunlight, how they glowed when wet, how their shapes reminded her of other things: an egg, a tooth, a claw. Her fascination spread to others, and soon the group began to notice beauty where once they had seen only utility. The cracked shell of an ostrich egg was no longer just a container for food. It became an object of curiosity, a thing of fragile perfection that seemed to hold the mystery of life itself. The giant ostrich ancestor, still roaming the same lands, became a silent teacher in their growing awareness. Its speed, its vigilance, fierce protection of its nest offered lessons in survival and cooperation. But for Homo habilis, these observations were evolving into something more complex. An emotional connection, even admiration. When a male Homo habilis stumbled upon a fallen ostrich egg, he did not simply break it for food. He paused, touching it gently, sensing its warmth, perhaps realizing that it contained life not yet born. This moment, insignificant by the scale of nature, was monumental in the story of the mind. It was empathy in its earliest form. To care, even for a moment, about something beyond one's immediate survival was the beginning of morality, of understanding that life itself was sacred. That spark of feeling would grow across millennia into art, religion, and compassion. The band continued their migration, following the rhythm of the seasons. The journey was difficult, filled with hunger and danger, but their growing intelligence gave them new ways to endure. Learn to track herds not just by sight, but by the faint prints in the soil, by the smell of distant dung, by the calls of scavenger birds. They began to remember the locations of safe shelters and water sources, passing this knowledge through imitation, gesture, and sound. The sounds they made were still primitive, not yet language, but there was rhythm, pattern, tone, enough to carry meaning, enough to build trust. When danger came, a predator's approach, a storm's warning, they no longer acted as individuals but as a coordinated group. Each movement, each signal, each shared glance carried intention. The world was no longer just something they lived in, it was something they could read. And in learning to read it, they began slowly to write their place within it. On one fateful afternoon, a great thunderstorm swept across the plains. The sky darkened with clouds that churned like black smoke, and the air was filled with the electric scent of rain. The Homo habilis huddled beneath a rocky overhang, watching in awe as lightning split the sky, striking the ground with a sound like the roar of a giant beast. For the first time, they saw fire not as a destroyer, but as light, a thing that lived and breathed with energy. When the storm passed and the rain ceased, they crept out and found the smoldering remains of a tree, its branches still glowing with embers. One of them reached toward it, flinching at the heat, pulled back, eyes wide with understanding. The fire fascinated them. It was warm, bright, alive. They didn't yet know how to make it, but in that moment they had learned to observe it, to see cause and effect. This, too, was the dawn of understanding, realizing that the world followed rules that could be learned and, someday, controlled. As the days passed, they experimented with their growing minds. They began to shape stones with greater precision, turning rough edges into sharp blades. They discovered that certain stones broke more predictably than others, and that by striking them in just the right way, they could make tools better suited for cutting, scraping, and carving. The making of a tool was no longer just a matter of instinct, it was a deliberate act, a product of memory and foresight. The group gathered around the sound of stone meeting stone, the rhythm of creation echoing like a heartbeat through the valley. When one of them succeeded in creating a new, sharper flake, the others copied, practiced. The birth of teaching had begun, not through words, but through imitation and observation, through the shared act of learning together. That silent exchange of knowledge, the seeds of culture were planted. The giant ostrich ancestor continued to appear in their lives, sometimes near, sometimes far, its movements always graceful and sure. To Homo habilis, the bird became part of their memory, a symbol of endurance and freedom. They learned from its vigilance, from its instinct to protect its eggs and its nest. In their own way, they began to mirror this behavior, guarding their young more carefully, building safer sleeping places, watching for danger together. The connection between species was not spoken but lived, written into the rhythm of the land itself. Every creature, every sound, every shadow had meaning. The Homo habilis were no longer simply surviving, they were interpreting, feeling, understanding. As night fell across the land, group gathered once again beneath the stars. The fire they had found still smoldered faintly in a pile of charred wood, watched its glow with fascination and reverence. Above them, the constellations shimmered, ancient and unchanging, and though they did not yet have the words to describe them, something within their minds stirred with recognition. They began to sense patterns in the heavens, just as they had on earth, to connect the lights above with the rhythms of their lives below. The world, once a chaos of sounds and dangers, was becoming a tapestry of connections, a web of meaning woven through sky, land, and life. In that sacred silence, 'neath the canopy of stars and the distant cry of the ostrich ancestor, the first true dawn of understanding arrived. It did not come with speech or invention, but with awareness. The realization that the world was more than a place to survive in, a mystery to explore. The Peiras Homo habilis had begun to think, to feel, to wonder. They were still creatures of earth and instinct, but their minds had touched something eternal. From that spark would rise everything: language, art, science, belief. And though millions of years would pass, and their bones would turn to dust, that ancient spark would endure, carried forward in every human gaze that ever looked at the stars and asked, why?